Good morning. My name is Ronald Lauder, for those of you who don't know me, and my brother Leonard, we founded the Alzheimer Drug Discovery Foundation, or its predecessor, 17 years ago, with a thought that we wanted to put our money into basic research, because at that time, nobody was putting money into basic research. Over the last 15 years, when it was finally started, we've invested almost 500 different projects in 18 countries. And we've seen many of these move along, and today, at least 40 of our projects are now in one phase or another in clinical testing, and it's amazing. We are getting closer to resolving the question of what causes Alzheimer's and what can be done. There's still a long way to go, but it's getting shorter every day. You're going to hear in a couple of minutes from Dr. Howard Fillit, who we've worked together with, I guess, 15 years, 20 years? In 20 years, it seems like 15. In 20 years, Howard has always explained to me all the different scientific things about Alzheimer's and about medicine, all of which I did not understand. But slowly but surely, it's coming through. I thank you all for coming. It's in November, and November is Alzheimer's Awareness Month. And I think every month is Awareness Month, because as we get older, we become more aware. And again, I thank you all for coming. I think this is a record turnout. With that, I would like to turn it over to Howard. And again, I thank every one of you, not only for your contributions, but your interest, because it's something very special. When we first started, we had almost nobody interested, and over the years, it was amazing. You're going to hear some very exciting news today. And now I turn it over to Howard Fillit, and thank you again. Howard, good luck.
I'm looking forward to seeing you. What? Thank you, Ronald. Well, thank you, Ronald, and thanks all of you for many of you supporting us over many years to get to where we are today and where we're going in the future. And thank you for coming today. I really appreciate it. I know this is a huge problem for all of us, and it's just going to be growing. And we are getting closer. I've been doing this for over 35 years, taking care of people with Alzheimer's disease and doing research on Alzheimer's. And from my perspective, the changes have been incredible over 35 years. Over my professional lifetime, I remember when I started, people would say, "What do you do?" And I say, "I do research and take care of people with Alzheimer's disease." And they'd say, "Alzheimer's disease? I never heard of that. Alzheimer's disease? I never heard of that." And of course, now we've all heard of it and we all know it. My own father died 2 summers ago from it. So let's find out how we can figure out how to prevent it and treat it. What we are facing. Well, you all hear a lot of statistics. I don't want to bombard you with statistics. But there will be 28 million baby boomers in the United States with Alzheimer's disease, an enormous number. Deaths from Alzheimer's disease are increasing by about 40% a year now, because baby boomers are hitting old age at 10,000 a day. And deaths from heart disease and cancer are going down. Soon, Alzheimer's will be the leading cause of death in the elderly, and it's already the leading cause of disability in people over the age of 75. Huge individual and societal issues. The Rand Corporation recently estimated that the cost of Alzheimer's, it's the most expensive disease in our society, over $226 billion a year. If we don't find drugs to prevent Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's alone in the next 10 years could bankrupt Medicare. So what is ADDF's approach? Well, as you can see here, this The data that support what is behind the boxes here comes from the National Institutes of Health. They created a database, and they asked all the various entities up on the screen to submit their grant programs and code them according to a common metric, according to where the programs were. And you can see here there's different, different, sorry, I don't know where the pointer is on this one. But you can see here that the different categories, care and support, epidemiology, diagnosis and assessment, and the green is drug discovery and clinical trials. And you can see that that's a different one. Thank you. You can see that this is ADDF here. And you can see how different we are just dramatically compared to the Alzheimer's Research Society of the United Kingdom, the National Institutes of Health, the Alzheimer's Association. All we do is 100% of every dollar donated to the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation not only goes to research, but it goes to drug research. It doesn't go, a penny does not go to basic research. And just to make some comparisons with the other foundations and not to dismiss them in any way because they all do valuable things, I think you see here that in this current data, 95% of our money, and really 100%, goes to drug research out of our budget of $7.3 million last year. That was coded in the database, while the Alzheimer's Association, you can see 5% of their donated dollars went to drug research, and the Cure Alzheimer's Fund, which is based up in Boston, 10% of their money, $650,000, $7 million, 7.3. So not only are we the only foundation solely dedicated to drug discovery, but we're the leading foundation dedicated to drug discovery and development for Alzheimer's disease. So let's talk about our scientific strategy. How do we go about developing drugs for Alzheimer's disease? Well, of course, all science begins with basic research, and we know one thing about Alzheimer's disease for sure, and that is that aging is the leading risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. There's no doubt about that. It increases with age. And so what do we know about aging? Well, there's a field called gerontology, biological gerontology, which is the study of aging. And so all of our organs are affected by certain factors that also affect the brain and contribute to Alzheimer's disease. And these include things like living on Earth, oxidation. We're constantly being bombarded by oxidative processes, which our bodies try to fix all the time. That's why we eat blueberries. Blueberries live in the sun. They're blue because over eons and hundreds of millions of years under the sun, they've developed the best antioxidants because the sun creates oxidative products. Vascular disease, hypertension, and diabetes are risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. Genetics and epigenetics, which are fascinating. Alzheimer's is not a genetic disease. It's very, very rarely caused by a mutation. But the field of epigenetics, which is how the environment affects the expression of our genes over our lifetimes, is a really fascinating new field. And there are already drugs, because epigenetic changes in our genes cause cancer. It releases cells to proliferate. And there are already drugs for cancer that are epigenetic drugs. So one of the things I'm going to tell you about a little later is how we can repurpose cancer drugs that are epigenetics or create new drugs that have been developed for cancer on the principles of cancer for fixing the epigenetic changes in the brain that lead to neurodegeneration. Neuronal energy failure. The brain is 3% of the body weight, and it uses 25% of the body's energy, 25% of oxygen and 25% of glucose. If you think about what happens to a diabetic when their glucose goes below 60, the first thing that happens immediately is they become unconscious. That's how dependent the brain is on glucose. Now with aging, we get insulin resistance, and we get insulin resistance in our brain. And our mitochondria, the powerhouse of all our cells, becomes inefficient. And this theory of neuronal energy failure has been around since the early 1980s, but we haven't been able to develop effective drugs to fix the neuronal energy failure and the insulin resistance that occurs in the brain with aging and leads to neuronal failure and dementia. Inflammation. We are all experiencing inflammation right now. There was a study that showed recently that if you mix mice with osteoarthritis, and amyloid, which is the sine qua non, the characteristic pathology of Alzheimer's disease, that the mice who have osteoarthritis and amyloid do much worse than the mice that only have amyloid. Systemic inflammation, arthritis, heart failure, diabetes, hypertension, repeated infections, all affect the brain. Think about how you feel when you get sick. If you get a virus, what happens? Old people with pneumonia, the first symptom of pneumonia in older people, I'm a geriatrician, as many of you know, so we teach medical students the different ways that disease expresses itself in old age. If you get pneumonia when you're 30, you're going to have a cough and a fever. If you get pneumonia when you're 80, the first symptom of pneumonia is confusion. That's because systemic inflammation affects the brain. And there's also inflammation in the brain as we deposit these amyloid proteins. They're very irritant, they cause misfolding, and they create brain inflammation. And so we have to adjust, we have to develop anti-inflammatories that are brain-specific to attack that, and damage proteins. If you think about adding lemon juice to a glass of milk, what happens to the milk? It curdles. If you heat an egg, what happens to the egg? It becomes scrambled. What that means is that you're getting misfolded proteins. Basically, the idea is the DNA makes the protein folds into a three-dimensional shape, and it's the three-dimensional shape that makes the protein work. When that protein is no longer in the right shape, it doesn't work, and it becomes toxic. So a lot of the programs that are out there today are trying to fix this misfolding that happens with aging. So these are some of the principles that lead to neuronal dysfunction and death, and ultimately to Alzheimer's dementia. Now, we want to repurpose that. We want to use that knowledge of gerontology to develop drugs for Alzheimer's disease. And I'll just really quickly show you that here's our current portfolio based on the targets of our investments in 2000. And you can see that there's a largest portfolio is neuroprotection, and I'll show you why in a minute, but neuroinflammation, epigenetics, neuronal energy, and also some of the genetic factors, ApoE, which I won't have time to talk about all this today. But we do have a scientific strategy for how we're going about creating innovation in the development of drugs for Alzheimer's disease. Now, the drug pipeline looks something like this. It starts with basic science, and when we usually think of research, we think of basic science. We don't fund any of this. Where we come in is when drug discovery starts. Chemistry. Basic science is mostly about biology. Developing drugs is mostly about chemistry. It's really hard to develop a drug. It's interesting, fascinating science for a medicinal chemist who's the expert in this kind of chemistry to think in their mind's eye of what a drug would look like that would fit in the pocket of a protein and fix that protein and treat Alzheimer's disease. It's really amazing, amazing science. But drug discovery is mostly about chemistry. It's about testing drugs in animals, finally getting a result in an animal, and doing the regulatory science that follows that so that a drug, a molecule, can go to the FDA, and the FDA can bless it and say, okay, it's safe enough in pigs and dogs and monkeys and mice that you can try that for the first time in human beings, and that's the IND enabling stage, the investigational new drug stage. That's the regulatory science that we need to know about. And then finally, we get into human clinical trials. Now, this whole process takes 12 to 15 years and probably at least $2 billion. Most of the cost, one clinical trial in Alzheimer's disease costs $400 million. Imagine, and you need at least 2 and generally 4 to get a drug to market and prove that it really works. Imagine if you were the woman who was the head of drug development at Pfizer, and you had to make the decision whether to take a risk on a $2 billion program. And we've had a 99.6% failure rate in our field because this is really hard to do. So are you going to be a risk taker? Maybe not, because you have a family at home. With the nonprofit model, we can take risks. We can build innovation into this and create new drugs that can be taken up by the Pfizers of the world to do that late-stage clinical development. So relatively small amounts of money here, hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, and even in early phase clinical trials, small millions of dollars, 2 to 5, can make a big difference in handing off these programs to the big pharmaceutical companies. So let's talk about some of the clinical trials that we're supporting, because that's where hope is. If you go through what I just told you, this process, then you can see that there's a preclinical portfolio and there's a clinical portfolio. I'm going to talk mostly about the clinical portfolio. In the early days, when we were trying to develop and create innovation, our portfolio was predominantly preclinical, with about 13% in clinical trials. Today, our portfolio is almost half, and in 2015, it probably will end up being about 50-50. So our programs are moving through the pipeline into the clinic. And not only that, but right now we did some research on a website that's run by the government called clinicaltrials.gov, where all clinical trials have to be registered throughout the world. And that includes pharmaceutical industry, academics, and so on. And there's about 120 clinical trials going on right now in Alzheimer's. That's really great. That's amazing. But about 70 or 80% of those trials are in one field, which is the anti-amyloid field. And we don't know if that theory is right or not. And Big Pharma and NIH and some foundations have spent literally tens of billions of dollars testing this one field. Today we're going to honor Richard Mose from Lilly. Lilly has a phase 3 clinical trial right now, which is very interesting and could give us results within a year or so about whether one of their products can actually work against the amyloid. But even if we get an anti-amyloid therapy, it's going to still require, just like in diabetes and hypertension, we're going to need a panoply of drugs to attack this because, as I showed you earlier, there's a lot of ways that neurons can get injured with aging. But I found, when they showed me this, when the staff showed me this, I was really quite amazed that of the 120 or so clinical trials that are currently going on, ADDF has contributed in some way with money and expertise and resources to about 20% of those trials. So we've had an impact in moving drugs into clinical testing around the world, as Ronald mentioned, in 18 countries. Now, here's one of the most advanced products. I mentioned Lilly. This is the Biogen study. When this study came out, it was a phase 1b study, which means it was an early stage clinical trial. And what you're looking at here is the amyloid in the brain of a patient who was treated with a placebo, and the amyloid in the brain at the end of the trial in the patient who was treated with the vaccine. And you can see, I think, quite clearly, based on this PET scan, where the red shows you there was a lot of amyloid, it identifies the amyloid based on the PET scan, that the drug, the vaccine, seems to work. And this is really exciting. It was associated with a stabilization of clinical function. This test has revolutionized the way we do clinical trials. We've been doing clinical trials for 35 years. One of the things that's been a great advance is we've learned how to do clinical trials in Alzheimer's. When I ran some clinical trials at Rockefeller University in the early 1980s and enrolled Alzheimer patients, I thought I was enrolling Alzheimer patients. The recent studies from Lilly using this test showed that 35% of the people enrolled in clinical trials didn't even have Alzheimer's because they didn't have a positive amyloid scan. Now, I'm proud to tell you that this amyloid scan was created by ADDF at the University of Pennsylvania. We started funding this in 1999. It was spun out into a biotech company called Avid Radiopharmaceuticals in 2005. The company was purchased by Eli Lilly for $800 million in 2010. And in 2012, this test became the first diagnostic test approved by the FDA for the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And in my practice, if somebody really wants to know if they have Alzheimer's, I can send them to the radiology office on 72nd Street, and they can get this test. But the other thing is the Biogen study was the first clinical trial where 100% of the people who went into the trial we actually knew had Alzheimer's disease. And the second thing is that by using this test, this biomarker, we don't have to do a phase 3 with 3,000 people to see if we get a signal whether the drug engages its target. We're seeing that right here in a phase 1 study with 120 people. It's not $400 million. It's about $20 to $50 million. So it quickens the pace. It accelerates the program. It provides more rigor to the trials. It reduces their cost. We can get an answer. And the other thing that the test has done is that for those of you who are interested, we can prescribe the test, and you can find out if you're cooking Alzheimer's disease right now, because we've learned from this test that Alzheimer's starts 20 to 30 years before we become symptomatic. Just like cholesterol identifies people at risk 20, 30, 40, 50 years before they have a heart attack, we can do that now in Alzheimer's disease. And what that's done is it's enabled prevention research for the first time. So we can identify, and there are several very large, multi-$100 million studies going on to look at prevention. Now let's talk about ADDF and some of those clinical trials, the novel clinical trials that we funded. So here's all the theories and all what we know about, about the the multiple pathways that the neurons get injured. So wouldn't it be great if you could come up with a drug that, regardless of the kind of injury, through evolution, cells have developed protective pathways, especially in the brain. And those pathways are signaling pathways that say to the cell, listen, you're so damaged, you got to get out of here. That's a technical word called apoptosis. And so when those death signals are triggered, when the cell is so damaged that the death signals are triggered, the cell kills itself. But at the same time, in this balance, the cell's saying, gee, I wonder if, despite all this, if I can turn on some survival mechanisms. And these are some of the most powerful survival mechanisms we know. Nerve growth factor, BDNF. I won't go into the technical aspects of it, but we're supporting programs to promote cell survival because while we can have a incremental benefit by addressing these issues, we might be able to have a very parsimonious benefit if we could promote cell survival. And so we're funding Frank Longo, who's the chairman of neurology. This is one example, chairman of neurology and neurosciences at Stanford University Medical Center. And Frank has been developing this drug for many years, as I'll show you. We started funding Frank in 2000 to do screening. He did it on a computer. He had the picture of using chemical software of the receptor for this neuroprotective factor. And then he bought a software library of 2 million compounds, and he screened it using a computer algorithm. He found 60 out of those 2 million compounds that fit chemically. And out of those, he bought those 60 in powder form, tested them in cells, and found 2 that actually protected and were protective in neuroprotection assays. We funded him to do that for 4 years. We continued to fund him to do medicinal chemistry to refine these candidates. And in 2005, we gave him money to spin out a biotech company called Farmatrophic. And they started doing preclinical testing to bring these drugs into human beings. And in 2009, he started doing his IND enabling work. And in 2013, we gave him money along with others because now we're syndicating the money in the biotech company. So ADDF became the seed capital for venture capitalists and other donors from family offices like the Dolby family, Ray Dolby's family, and others. Eric Schmidt from Google is in this now. And he did a phase 1 that showed the drug was safe. And now he's just finished a round, just last week, of $10 million that ADDF contributed in to do a phase 2 study, which is the first time that a drug is tested for whether or not it works in human beings. A long road, but we're very excited about this because if this works, it will have widespread applicability in treating people with Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative disorders like ALS and others. Now, in inflammation, we can actually see inflammation on the brain. This is a brain scan of a patient with Alzheimer's disease. You don't typically think of Alzheimer's as an inflammatory illness, but it is. And it's pretty prominent. And so this is a brain scan of a patient with Alzheimer's disease showing it's lighting up the cells that are the inflammatory cells that are specialized brain cells called microglia that attack and create damage. And at the same time, these same microglia have a two-edged sword. Because when you get all these deposits of amyloid, these are toxic deposits. They're garbage. They're toxic garbage in the brain. We're all producing this stuff right now. But through evolution, our bodies, our cells, have figured out ways to remove the damaged proteins. It's a quality control mechanism. And we're all doing this right now in every cell in our body. With aging, that quality control process breaks down. The removal of these toxic misfolded proteins breaks down. They deposit in the brain. They become the plaques. They become the tangles that are the neuronal injury. So at the same time that the cells are bad because they're secreting inflammatory molecules that are neurotoxic, those cells are also good because they're the garbage disposal cells of our brain. We've had a lot of failures in clinical trials of anti-inflammatories over the years for Alzheimer's disease. We've tried Celebrex and Motrin and ibuprofen and other, prednisone has been tried. We did prednisone clinical trial back in the 1980s at Mount Sinai, and they've all failed. I think part of the reason they failed is because the clinical trials weren't designed right, but also because we haven't had the right drugs. And so we're very excited about our neuroanti-inflammatory program right now. We're funding a biotech. Phil Hayden is the director of drug development at Tufts University. He spun out a company called GliaCure, and his molecule here is in a phase 1 clinical trial that we're funding right now to promote the garbage disposal, the good parts of this inflammatory process, to help clear the brain of these toxic molecules. And Paolo is an ex-pharmaceutical scientist who created a company in Milan, Italy, that is an anti-inflammatory program that will reduce the bad side effects of inflammation, that will protect the brain by reducing the bad parts of inflammation. And we're very excited about both of these companies. And we could see that there would be a cocktail of drugs that we would give people over time, just like we take cocktails. I have patients that are on 3 or 4 antihypertensives and diabetics who are on 3 or 4 antidiabetics. Epigenetics is amazing. Think about why, if you have trauma in your young age, stress, the Holocaust, depression, malnutrition, and 30, 40, 50 years later, you're still affected by that. Is that purely a Sigmund Freud neuropsychological process in the brain? Or has something in the brain changed that's permanent? And what we now know is that, for example, in the case of cancer, that the reason that these cells go crazy and proliferate into tumors is because the interface between the environment, pesticides, lead, and everything, is that the genetic code doesn't change, but all the regulatory proteins on the genetic code can be changed by these environmental toxins and environmental processes like stress. So Li Wei Sai, for example, out of MIT, is a neuroscientist who showed that with aging, the expression of neuronal synaptic plasticity, or ability to make memories, is changed by these epigenetic changes. The genetic code isn't changed, but the way that the genetic code is translated is changed. And as I mentioned earlier, there are drugs right now for cancer that attack this. And what we're doing is we're funding a company called Horizon Genomics, which was a cancer company in Barcelona. And we said to them, and they said to us, because we met, we want to translate this into Alzheimer's. Our board says to us, we're a cancer company. We're not spending our board's money on Alzheimer's disease, but if you give us a grant, then our board will let us do this program. And so we've been funding them for a number of years now, and right now we're funding them to go into clinical trials for the first time with a drug for epigenetics for Alzheimer's disease, which we're really excited about. They're a terrific group. They just raised $19 million in a round of financing from various people in Europe, various entities. And we're just really excited to be working with Horizon Genomics right now to develop a drug to fix this epigenetic problem of Alzheimer's disease and EVX. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is repurposing. If you think about Viagra, how did Viagra get to market? Viagra was a drug in development for pulmonary hypertension. And the men were coming in with a side effect. And some interesting scientists said, let's repurpose that drug for erectile dysfunction. And let's find the lemonade in the lemon here. And that's called repurposing. So in the 1950s, you probably remember that thalidomide was a horrible drug for women who were pregnant. Today, thalidomide is the leading drug for the treatment of multiple myeloma, a repurposing of a drug. So what we feel as our strategy is that repurposing is critically important for rapidly developing drugs to see if they work in phase 2 small trials, getting a signal. And then if we get a signal in a phase 2 on a repurposed drug that's already approved by the FDA on the market, I can prescribe it, we know the safety profile, then the next day that a phase 2 study that maybe takes 3 years and $2 to $5 million, I could prescribe that drug for my patients. And quite frankly, I'm already doing that with some of these drugs, and then trying to do the clinical trial to see whether we can get the data. So I'm going to go real quickly through this. Right now, we're repurposing the leading drug for the treatment of ALS, the only drug that's ever been shown to change the course of ALS, which is another neurodegenerative illness that is very similar in mechanisms. It affects different cells, motor cells, not cognitive cells, for example, how we think. But Riluzole, or Rilutech is the brand name, has been on the market for many years. We know the safety profile. We're funding a phase 2 clinical trial of Riluzole for Alzheimer's disease at Rockefeller. Michaela Gallagher is one of the most famous neuroscientists in the world on how memories are made. She had the idea that an epilepsy drug called levetiracetam could be good for the treatment of mild cognitive impairment in Alzheimer's. We helped her to spin out a biotech company out of Johns Hopkins to develop her drug, and she's in a phase 3 right now, a phase 3 trial to repurpose this drug called levetiracetam for the treatment of Alzheimer's, an epilepsy drug being repurposed for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And Clive Holmes has shown that Enbrel, which if you ever see the pictures on TV of Phil, what's his name, the golfer, I'm blocking on it, Phil Mickelson, right? He always says, you know, I wouldn't be able to play golf if it wasn't for this drug, Enbrel, for rheumatoid arthritis. And Clive has shown that that drug works for Alzheimer's. And there's really a lot of interesting data around this issue. So we're just funding, along with the Alzheimer's Society of the United Kingdom, this drug for Alzheimer's disease. So repurposing has the near-term potential to develop drugs for the treatment. And I'll go through this neuronal energy failure, again, insulin resistance. We're repurposing a diabetes drug called liraglutide at the Imperial College of London. We seeded this trial with $750,000. Novo Nordisk came in to donate the drug, which is very costly. General Electric came in to develop to fund the brain scans. The Alzheimer's Society and the Medical Research Council of the UK came in to fund it. And so now it's gone from a $750,000 trial to a $6 million trial that we seeded. And the last repurposing one I'll talk about is Jeff Cummings, who's using a Parkinson's disease drug that we came to him and we said, Jeff, we want to try this. What do you think? He went back. He looked at it. He's a neurologist. Rasagiline is one of the only drugs that's ever been shown to alter the course of Parkinson's disease. We're repurposing that for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease right now. And the last thing I want to talk about is prevention. We know a lot about prevention now for Alzheimer's disease. The sound bite I would give you is, and I know it seems simplistic, but there's a lot of science behind this, a lot of science, epidemiology, in vitro biology, animal model studies, and even clinical trials to support the sound bite that, number one, everything you do today to think about how you can prevent a heart attack will also protect your brain. And we could talk about the mechanisms and the science behind that, why it's true. But it probably is true, and there's certain elements of this that are absolutely true, particularly exercise, certain aspects of diet, supplements, and we're funding clinical trials right now of various vitamin supplements like vitamin B1, not thiamine, which doesn't get into the brain very well, but a drug called benfotiamine. We're funding at Cornell to look at that. And the only other thing that's a little different about Alzheimer's in terms of prevention is your brain is the interface between yourself and the environment. And your brain is plastic. Your brain is like a muscle. You can imagine people being socially isolated who become crazy. Soldiers put in a black hole for a year, come out, and their brains are literally atrophied. Literally atrophied. So remaining socially and occupationally engaged, continue learning throughout life, and you'll build your brain. There was a study in China many years ago that showed that years of education in early life through college, how well you built your brain in early life was directly related to your risk of Alzheimer's disease in late life, whether that's an epigenetic effect or just what we call cognitive reserve. Build your cognitive reserve so that when you start getting hit by all these aging-related factors on damaging your brain, you're going to have a lot of resource to tolerate that continuing injury throughout life, so that hopefully all of us can, I will say, die in the middle of the night from a heart attack, having hugged our loved ones and our grandchildren, and perhaps even still working to the very end of our days. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take any questions. Yes, sir.
Why B1 versus B12?
So the question is why B1 versus B12? It's actually not versus, but it's both. So B12 deficiency, when we assess a patient for Alzheimer's disease, one of the things we always rule out, and this is in the clinical guidelines, is we do a B12 test, because we know that people who have B12 deficiency, and that's very hard to get from diet. So people who have B12 deficiency actually cannot absorb it because of a stomach problem called pernicious anemia. It's a disease. It's an autoimmune disease. So we probably 1 in 100 people that come in with a memory complaint into the office have a B12 deficiency, and it's treatable, right? So B12 deficiency, the mechanisms of B12 on the brain are probably neuroprotective. B1 thiamine, thiamine plays a critical role in glucose utilization in the brain. The best example clinically to demonstrate that is alcoholics who come into, and I remember doing this during my training, alcoholics would come in and they'd be malnourished and they'd have what's called a dementia called Wernicke's encephalopathy. It's a technical term. But alcoholics would come in demented, in delirious into the clinic. And you'd give them a shot of thiamine and all of a sudden they were better. And because thiamine is critical to your ability to use glucose in the brain. The problem with thiamine is that it's not that effective on a long-term basis. So there was a drug out there sort of on the in the web called benfotiamine, which was modified thiamine that helps the thiamine get into the brain more effectively. And that's the clinical trial that we're funding at Cornell right now with Gary Gibson. You can't really measure thiamine in the blood very well. So that's one of the clinical problems why it's not routinely done. But this is sort of a therapeutic program to improve glucose utilization in the brain. Vitamin D is also turning out to be a risk factor for dementia. Vitamin D is a hormone. It's important for your bones, but it has a lot of other functions, and there are vitamin D receptors in the brain, and people who are vitamin D deficient can have memory problems. Vitamin D is a neuroprotective hormone. So that's why we always test for vitamin D deficiency as well. Any other questions? Anybody else? Yes? So the hereditary factors, thank you for that question of Alzheimer's. So there's really 3 aspects to hereditary with Alzheimer's. I mentioned the epigenetics, which is the effect of environment on our genes over the course of a lifetime, which we need to fix. We need to develop drugs to fix that. And then at the other extreme, you have the rare mutations. So less than 1% of people with Alzheimer's disease have rare mutations, mostly in that amyloid protein that we've talked about, that lead to Alzheimer's disease and dementia. But it's really rare, and it's a mutation. And I've seen families where everyone in the family got Alzheimer's disease in their 30s. That's really rare. But the other factor that we've known about for over 25 years is a molecule called apolipoprotein E. And this is actually a cholesterol-carrying protein that's made in the brain that's very important for neuronal repair because it carries cholesterol to the neurons and helps them to repair themselves. Now, it's a good example because 60% of people with Alzheimer's have a variant of ApoE called ApoE4. And if you have an ApoE4, if you get one of those from your parent, mother or father, you have 5 times the risk of Alzheimer's. If you get 2 of them, you have 15 to 20 times the risk of getting Alzheimer's. And you will get it 10 years earlier. So you'll get it at age 68 or 65 instead of 75 or 78. So we've known about this risk factor for over 25 years. And it's a good example where biology doesn't always lead to drugs. Because even though we've known about it for 25 years, we haven't been successful in developing a drug to fix it. Very low-hanging fruit for a drug. We have one of the largest, thanks to the Belfer family, we have one of the largest portfolios of ApoE therapeutics in the world. And right now we're very excited because I think we found an approach to fix it, which is gene therapy. Because if you have the ApoE2 variant, you're protected and you tend towards longevity. So what we're trying to do with advances in gene therapy is insert the ApoE2 gene into a virus that's not infectious, put that virus into the brain, into the cells that make ApoE, which are what's called the glia. And so we know that even if you have ApoE4, you can negate the negative effects of ApoE4 with ApoE2. So we'll do gene therapy. It'll be a single injection, probably last a lifetime, and hopefully fix the ApoE4 problem. And we're funding that at Harvard right now and at Cornell. This is not down the road. Actually, it's in IND-enabling stage, so there will be clinical trials of this in the next couple of years. One can be tested. If one wants to, one can be tested. The way I use it, I spend about 5 or 10% of my time in clinical practice. I've always wanted to keep my clinical practice because it keeps my feet on the ground and always reminds me of why I'm doing science. Your doctor can take some blood and do the ApoE gene test if you want to know. So for example, if I see a patient where they come down with Alzheimer's at age 70, or 68, and their parent had it, and a grandmother had it, and they want to know if there's a risk factor in terms of their children, or whether they're going to get it, you can just order the test and get the test. And it can be reassuring to know that you don't have it. And if you do have it, maybe make a donation to ADDF and we'll fix it. So I encourage everybody to get the test. Okay. Yes, sir.
How do you decide 6% versus 20% in a given area? And secondly, how do you select pharmaceutical companies?
Thank you for that question. So the question is really about portfolio management and also partnerships. We have a really great investment committee on our board right now. Tom McWilliams, Randall Sandler, Bob Belfer, and of course Ronald and Leonard Lauder, and some others. And so they've really asked me to apply the rigor of financial investing to our scientific portfolio. I think that it's a little different than financial planning because I can't say, okay, we're going to put 20% in small caps, 40% in mid caps, and 60% in bonds, or whatever you want to do. You can't just do that in science. Because what we do, we get almost 500 applications every year from all over the world with new ideas for Alzheimer's. And I never know what target that's going to be about. I have 150 scientists to help me evaluate these programs, and I've got 5 full-time PhD staff to evaluate these. And we're funding about 40 or 50 programs a year. So 6 to 8% of the programs that we get in are actually funded. So it's partly sort of an organic way to the portfolio. If somebody has a new idea to fix ApoE, I want to fund it. If somebody has a novel neuroprotective drug, I want to fund it. So it's partially identifying the really important targets, and it's partially built from the bottom up. In terms of partnerships, we are Pfizer's external R&D partner for Alzheimer's disease. So Pfizer has outsourced in closing a lot of their large facilities, like in Groton or in Sandwich in the UK. And what the precedent in industry right now is to scour the world, just as we're doing, for the best projects, and then bring all the expertise and resources of a pharmaceutical company, people, reagents, and so on, regulatory science, to help academics or small biotechs to move forward in partnerships. So Pfizer, for example, created an organization called the Center for Therapeutics Innovation, and they target various areas like cancer and so on. And we're Pfizer's partner in Alzheimer's disease. We just signed a memorandum of understanding with Eli Lilly to be Eli Lilly's partner in Alzheimer's. It's a different model. Of course, there's no conflicts. And so we're partnering in that way. We have many partnerships around the world. We're partnering with the Lewy Body Dementia Association, which you know, Robin Williams just died of that, presumably. We're a partner with the Alzheimer's Society of the United Kingdom. We have a clinical trial repurposing program with them. So partnerships with family offices. We're partners with the Dolby family office and other family offices, because family offices, let's say someone in the family has Alzheimer's and they want to do something in Alzheimer's, but they don't want to hire Howard Fillit and bring in an organization, but they want to take advantage of our organization. And with the generosity of the Lauder family through the trust, 100% of my salary and the overhead is paid. And when we partner with all of the organizations, we never charge an administrative cost. So we're just really good partners for a family office, for example, that wants to do something. We're seeing the deals. We're seeing the programs all over the world. We have the administrative structure to not only receive them and manage them, but to evaluate and do really expert due diligence, and then make recommendations to what should be funded.
Can you talk a little bit about if there's a correlation between the flu shot and Alzheimer's? And then my second question is about the difference between the Exelon patch between 9.5 and 13, if there is a difference, if it's still considered valuable, and also if you're serving blueberries at lunch.
Let's see if I can remember those 3 questions. I don't know if I can. I think I'm going to go for the scan pretty soon. Well, blueberries at lunch, I don't know the menu, but I do eat blueberries every morning. So that whether or not that's good or bad, I can't really say. But I think it can't hurt. That's what I main thing. Actually, there is data. Let me just say that in terms of prevention, we need better clinical trials. And so the European Commission, for example, and we're partnering on this, is actually doing a lifestyle intervention. It was just a paper published in a journal called Neurology showing that the Mediterranean diet, which is fruit and vegetables and very little meat and fish and some fish, actually protects against Alzheimer's. So there's evolving evidence to address your question. Do blueberries work? Well, we're doing the research to see because you can't just take blueberries in isolation, right? You're doing so many other things, whether you're sedentary, whether you eat meat, and this sort of thing. So we can't take, so the clinical trials that are evolving around prevention are holistic, which is really interesting. Exelon, there's drugs on the market. They've been around for almost 20 years now. They're all equivalent, Aricept, Exelon, Razodine. They improve cognition a bit. There's really no difference. In terms of dose, you just have to find a tolerable dose in your family member. And the patch is just another way to deliver it. And I forgot your first question already. I'm sorry. And the flu shot, there's no evidence that I know of that the flu shot has any risk for Alzheimer's disease. So thank you. Any other? Yes, over there.
Talk a little bit about the political landscape for Alzheimer's care and research and what we can do as citizen advocates to move us closer to a cure and treatment.
Yeah, so political advocacy has really, really come a long way, again, in my lifetime. President Obama created something with Congress called the NAPO, the National Alzheimer's Project Act, which for the first time really created a catalyst for Alzheimer's advocacy. And there are 12 members on this nationwide board, and some of them are patient care advocates, there's 1 or 2 doctors. There's been some, I forget the name right now, I'm blocking on the name, but there's a special way that the president can, it's called a bypass budget. And so normally the way the NIH is funded is that the Congress says, I will give you $28 billion this year, and you allocate it. So for example, just to give you a number, we spend $3,200 per patient per year on HIV/AIDS research, which is a manageable and preventable disease today, with about 35,000 deaths in the United States. $3,200 per patient per year. We spend $120 per patient per year on Alzheimer's disease. Most recently, 500,000 deaths, and the most expensive disease. So we need a lot of advocacy, and it's coming. For the first time, we're really seeing patient advocacy awareness. You see it on TV. I mean, I can't imagine 20 years ago thinking that I'd see a commercial or a movie about Alzheimer's disease in the popular press. I just can't even imagine that. But that's what we're seeing, still Alice, and a lot of people on the Hill advocating. But we need more of that, certainly. Yes?
Has there been any studies done with cannabis and Alzheimer's?
Cannabis and Alzheimer's is really interesting, and we're actually funding 2 projects, not about cannabis. You know, one of the most widely distributed, and this might not surprise you, but this is serious. One of the most widely distributed receptors in the brain is called the cannabinoid receptor. And there are 2 types, cannabinoid 1 and cannabinoid 2. And I don't know if I'll get this right or not, but cannabinoid 1 is the one that causes the psychotropic effect, and cannabinoid 2 is the one that causes disease modification and anti-inflammation. And Sanofi actually brought a drug to market that was a cannabinoid receptor, I forget if it was an agonist or an antagonist, but actually brought a drug to market. It was approved in Europe and in the United States for a short time, and then it was withdrawn, unfortunately, because of some bad side effects. We have investigators who have not cannabis, not marijuana, but have drugs, chemicals that are built that interact with that cannabinoid receptor and can activate it or block it. And so we're funding a project in Toronto at a clinic there to test one of these drugs that's currently on the market called Nabolone, to see if it can treat agitation and have a disease-modifying effect in people with Alzheimer's disease. And we're funding another project at Emory University with a novel cannabinoid receptor antagonist that can reduce inflammation in the brain. And we're also funding another project at the Cleveland Clinic, which we've just helped them to create a new biotech company called Neurotherapia, to develop cannabinoid agonists, cannabinoid drugs that affect this widespread receptor throughout the brain. The cannabinoid is really an important receptor. And what we have to do, again, knowing the biology is not enough. Developing the chemistry and the drugs that are safe and effective is the really challenging, exciting, hard part. And that's why we're honoring, for example, Richard Mose today, because people like Richard, 90%, to tell you how hard it is, 90% of the people who work in the pharmaceutical industry, Judy Levin said this, she was the chief financial officer at Merck for many years, 90% of the people who work in the pharmaceutical industry they spend their entire careers never working on a drug that comes to market, and that's the pharmaceutical industry. Now, that's not a negative statement. That's a statement about science being incremental and hard. But imagine if we could someday get a little white pill that could prevent Alzheimer's. How amazing would that be? And maybe it'll come from a cannabinoid receptor. How far away? Well, I think some of the, so the Nabolone study in Toronto is a repurposing experiment. And if it works, the next day that's published, I could prescribe it. So we're talking 3 to 5 years. The Lilly studies that are being done with the vaccines, 3 years we'll know the results, and it might be fast-tracked by the FDA. There are still pharmaceutical companies in this that are trying to do drugs. And I think in 5 years we're going to have a really good shot at our first disease-modifying drug that could be then used for prevention. So I'm very excited about that. And there's a lot of hope. And with that, let me thank you all for your attention. And happy to answer any other questions. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Randall Sandler. I'm Vice Chair of the Board of Governors of the ADDF. Thank you all for coming. I want to take one more opportunity to thank Howard for that incredible presentation and thank all of you for your thoughtful questions. I hope it gives you a sense as to what our portfolio looks like and really kind of the unique drive and mission of this organization, but also where all of your generous dollars go and how much closer we are to a cure because of your support. So with that, thank you again for coming. I invite you to start heading toward the ballroom for our luncheon and award ceremony. Thank you.